Listener focus we have been talking about very steadily. Purpose-centered, Leah, was extremely, I just see an even better purpose in the presentation you gave than the one you gave, but it's there, and it would be wonderful. Argument-driven, structure-supported. Structure is how you build what you have to say, but let me be clear, ultimately, structure is invisible to listening audiences and should be. It should simply do the job it does, rather than our talking about it a lot. It's clutter to say, frankly, usually first, second, third type stuff is clutter. Just get it out. Put the focus on advancing your content. Don't talk about your structure. Make sure it works. And I just feel really strongly about this because it's an easy thing to get better at quickly. So this may be cool for you. Certainly, in my experience and my emphasis, listeners focus a speech. Purpose drives a speech. Structure builds a speech. And takeaways rule. It doesn't help if someone comes away from your presentation and someone else says, "What did she say?" And the person who was at your presentation says, "Well, she talked a lot about the Superdome." And it was not what you know what I mean? It was like an anecdote or something in there, and that's what they took away. So we want structure that helps listeners register and remember what you said. And I'm going to start with the body of the presentation, not the opening, because the structures for the two of them are different. Because structure should, ideally and usually, is invisible, you can actually use a pattern of structure over and over and over again, but your listeners are content-driven, not structure-driven, so it doesn't sound repetitive. And this is what I would urge upon you. It's a chunk-based structure. In my view, here's where PowerPoint makes me nuts, and here's what makes me nuts about people who write presentations. You know how linear it is? But in my view, chunks are like plexiglass boxes, and they've got stuff inside. Let me show you. You create the body of your presentation, chunk, transition, chunk, from the beginning to the end. I'm holding aside the opening, and I'm holding aside the conclusion. This is the body of the presentation. But let's open one up and look inside. You have a handout at your place. It says user-friendly speech frameworks. That's the one that we're looking at now. Inside a chunk, in descending order of importance, not in linear order or chronological order here, there will be a point. What's a point? A point is the answer to the listener's question, and if the listener raised his hand and said, "Why am I listening to this?" the speaker would say, "Because," and here would come her point. So the point that the speaker is making should be the takeaway that the listener derives. Synonyms, just one point of view is the listener's and one point of view is the speaker's. Development of the point is the argument, anything that advances the listener's thinking on the point. It is the second most important part of the chunk. Support for the point is the anecdote, it's the statistics, it's the graph, it's the imagery. Support colors the point, and frankly, support is often much easier for a listener to remember than the point is. That's why you can't ever have support in a chunk that isn't supporting that point, because I'll remember it and not remember why you talk about it. So it needs to be tightly connected. So if we change the language, the point is the answer to the listener's question, "Why am I listening to this?" And the speaker would say, "Because," and then here would come the point. Development is anything that advances the listener's thinking on that point. And support supports the point so that it's clearer to the listener and the listener can recall it. The opening, right? We talked about the body. I'm not going to talk about conclusions because they are very dependent on what you've done. They're topic and they're dependent on everything, and so I cannot generalize about them. But the opening, your listeners, and hence you, want significantly front-loaded, top-heavy openings, doing real work, so that the audience is both engaged and informed from the start. And a hard-working opening, I call it the speaker's draft, because when we're designing it, you're writing this stuff, but you're taking the listener's point of view, and the listener is saying, why am I listening to this? A good opening answers that listener's question for the whole presentation and establishes the relevance and utility of the whole presentation. A lot. It's like the headline in the newspaper. In fact, that's the perfect analogy. You know, if the headline in the newspaper is doing its job right, you skip the story because you don't want to know about that one. If I'm doing it right in my presentation at a conference, you get up and leave because you know where I'm going and it isn't what you most want. There's nothing more listener-friendly than that. So put the weight at the front, but we don't like to. We like to kind of pull people along. Yeah, but listeners like newspaper headlines. I'm going to give you a default opening. By that I mean, if you have a better opening structure, use it. And if you don't, well, let me change the subject here. When I don't, I use this one. And it has these elements. It's a story. You'll recognize this right away. A situation that anchors the listener. The listener is like, okay so far. The listener, whatever I say first, the listener says, and I'll give you an example, I'm with you on that, or I bet that's true. And then comes the complication. Situation complication is the definition of a story. A problem that unsettles the situation in the story you're telling. What I was recommending to you, Leah, that it reorient so that I'm going like, ooh, not good. It's why you're speaking, the purpose of your presentation. It has to work hard. The question. This might be, why did that happen? What's wrong with what we tried? What should we do? It doesn't, many times the question isn't articulated because the listener is doing the work of saying, what was wrong with that? And that's fine. And then the answer to the question, which is the response to the question, your solution to the complication, and bang. It's like, you know how like no one has ever seen a werewolf at the very moment when a human being drops to all fours and turns into a wolf? That's what this is like. You can't really tell the ending of the opening and the beginning of the presentation because it just sort of morphs from one to the other. Halloween, that's where that came from. Your second handout has an example on this, and it says at the front, it's the one that's stapled, and it says a good opening. I'm going to give you as an example of this, now all broken out, the opening to a presentation that I did when my first book on difficult communication came out. It was at the Globes conference, Haaretz conference in Israel. A lot of speakers at the conference. And this is the format that I used. And I will tell you right now, because remember I was talking about, maybe it was before we even began, Kairos. We talked about logos, pathos, and ethos. Kairos is the moment. It's why people prepare presentations and then they wait for the events of the world to move in the direction they need so that they can seize the day. In my case, slight twist on this, this presentation was in 2008, just early it was November, I think, I can't remember, early in the financial crisis. And I was looking for a particular kind of story for my presentation, and I didn't have it, so I had a second best thing that I was going to use, and then it happened. It happened. And this is what happened. Here's my opening. Situation. Last week in Chicago, we had a new development in the financial crisis. Workers in a company that manufactures doors and windows took over the factory building in protest when they learned that the company was closing in 3 days without regard to laws covering 60-day notice and payment due to them. What I liked about this situation is that no one, including me, no one knew how bad it was going to get. No one knew if this was a one-off or if this was where we were headed now in the fall of 2008. My pathos here is I wanted my listeners unhappy and nervous. I know. You wish you were related to me, don't you? Here's the complication. the complication to the situation. The trigger for the workers in Chicago was how the information was communicated. It was communicated to them by avoiding the conversation altogether. What do you think my book is about? Difficult conversations. So this is perfect for me. Here comes the question. And I said that questions can be left implicit, but I went nuts on this question because it served me. The bankers and lawyers had strategies for the company closure and bankruptcy. But who said, here's what to do when you don't speak to the workers and they take over the building and call the press? Can you see that I want my listeners uncomfortable? Who had strategies and tactics for the person-to-person, human-to-human conversations that form all tough communication on the ground? Who thought through, here's what you say first, here's what you say second, here's third? Who said, here's how your counterpart is likely to respond? What are you going to do then? Do you think you would learn that from my book? We have strategies for high-level, even global communication. But at the player-to-player level, when the going gets tough, often it's not simply that we have poor strategies and tactics, but that we have none. This is a total downer of an opening. Perfect for me. Would you, if you were running a company in November 2008, are you going to get up out of my presentation, not knowing if this is a one-off or the first of a series? You're going to leave, you're going to stay? Yeah, they stayed. So, pulled apart, it is transparently clear how these elements play out. But there's more decision-making about what you're trying to do. What you think, you know, I like the dark side, so this is easy for me to have a bad news opening. But the structure is simple, clear, and direct. I want to take the lid off tough conversations and look at what makes them go wrong. I want to change unilaterally what we're trying to do. I want to do this in part because everyone's life, including mine, would be easier if we were all better at this. So now here, I'm saying, I just gave you a huge problem. Let me help you with your problem. So from my point of view, me the speaker, in this case, me the author, very shrewd opening. That it should be, you know, it shouldn't be like a aim for the lowest common denominator, just kind of talk about structure. Why doesn't it do some real work? Why not? I've never, maybe I used to think of a reason why openings didn't do any work, but I can't remember now. They could. It's helpful to the listener, it's helpful to you. There is no downside. And if somebody didn't want to stay for this presentation, I feel like, good. You know, they know. Good call. You should go do something else. Good, because you know. You're not going to later say, well, I couldn't tell from the way she started where it was going to go.